have been a transit form clerk for 19 years. I want to be clear about that from the start, because everything that follows depends on understanding what that means. Not as a confession of smallness, but as a plain statement of fact about the kind of man I am and the kind of attention I pay. A transit form clerk at Waystation Garev processes arrivals, renewals, temporary residency extensions, and departure clearances. That's the short version. The longer version is that I sit at window 3 in the Garev processing corridor from the 6th hour to the 18th hour, 6 days out of every 7, and I look at faces, hundreds of faces. I look at them the way a decent carpenter looks at a piece of wood, not to admire it, not to catalog it, just to understand what's there and what it needs. Most people who come to my window need a form stamped, a code entered, a date confirmed. They want the transaction to be fast and frictionless. I try to give them that. I am 41 years old. I have a small apartment on Garev's residential ring, 2nd level, north corridor, which gets the sunrise light and no direct view of the departure bays, which means I can sleep past the 6 o'clock loading cycle if I want to. I have a coffee press that takes too long even when there's nothing wrong with it. A collection of procedural law databases that I read in the evenings the way other people read novels, and the particular kind of life that comes from spending 2 decades in the same corridor, learning its rhythms so thoroughly that you know when the ventilation pressure drops in the 3rd ring before the maintenance board registers it, and when the afternoon supply shuttle is running late by the way the queue in the arrival hall shifts its collective weight. I mention the procedural law because it matters later. Waystation Garev is not a glamorous place. It sits in a mid-orbit position above the Varith border corridor, close enough to the old empire's transit lanes that it catches a lot of stateless traffic, people who have lost homeworld registration in the succession disputes, refugees from the border adjustments, traders whose paperwork follows 3 different legal frameworks, depending on which day of the accord cycle you ask. It is a station built for function, not for impression. The walls of the processing corridor are a gray beige that I believe was chosen specifically to be inoffensive in every lighting condition and succeeds at being uninspiring in all of them. The window partitions between the clerks and the applicants are made of impact-resistant polymer that has been cleaned so many thousands of times that it has acquired a very faint haze, not enough to obscure a face, but enough to soften the edges of things slightly, which I have come to think of as appropriate for this particular work. You are dealing with people in complicated situations. A little softening is honest. I process a lot of complicated forms. I am good at complicated forms. I have been good at them for 19 years. And the thing that makes me good at them is not speed, though I am efficient, and not an unusual memory for regulation codes, though I know them. The thing that makes me good at them is that I pay attention. I pay attention to the face, to the handwriting, to the order in which someone hands me their documents, to the small particular ways that a person gives themselves away when they're nervous, or tired, or frightened, or calculating. I do not do this to catch people in anything. I do it because attention is a form of respect. And the people who come to my window are people who need something, and they deserve to be seen as people and not as form numbers. She came to window 3 for the first time on a Tuesday, in what the Accord calendar calls the 44th week of cycle 9. I remember the day because I had just finished a particularly convoluted residency chain for a Keth-adjacent family of 6. 3 adults, 3 children, 2 different homeworld registrations that had been merged under the pre-accord convention, and then split again under the current one, which created a situation where the children technically existed in 2 different legal frameworks simultaneously. And I had to file a clarification notice with the Accord Registry Office to establish which framework the family was treating as primary. It had taken most of the morning. My coffee was cold, and I had about 40 minutes left in my shift, and was prepared to coast through them on whatever was left in the queue. She set her documents on the sill, and I looked down at them, and then I looked up at her, the way I always do, She was tall, taller than most of the humans I see at the window, taller than me by several centimeters, with deep copper-brown skin that caught the corridor lighting in a way that made it look warmer than the fluorescent panels deserved. Her hair was black, threaded with silver, not the gray silver of age, but something more deliberate, strands of actual silver that moved slightly differently from the rest of it, as though they had a different weight or a different surface texture. Catching light at angles the black hair didn't. She wore it pulled back and plain, no ornament, no particular effort to style it, just drawn back from her face with a practical efficiency. Her eyes were pale amber, almost gold, and she had the particular quality of attention that I have only ever seen in two kinds of people: the very old, and people who have spent a long time in places where being noticed was dangerous. I am not a man who makes assumptions, but I am a man who notices things and files them. Renewal, she said. Her voice was quiet and even, the kind of voice that doesn't carry any more than it intends to. That gives you exactly the information it means to give, and nothing else. I looked at her documents. Thessara Vale, I said, reading the name. She was still for a moment, not long, a quarter of a second, no more. And then she said, yes. I entered the renewal. The form asked for homeworld registration, and she had written, in very careful handwriting, unaffiliated, border transit corridor, registration pending, which is what everyone writes when they don't want to say what they are. I have seen it 10,000 times, on 10,000 forms, from 10,000 people in 10,000 complicated situations. I have learned not to press it unless the form legally requires further documentation, which the standard 14-day renewal does not. I stamped the renewal for 14 days, the standard extension for unaffiliated transit residents, and slid the documents back through the window. Tea, I said, and pushed the small cup that I keep at the corner of the sill toward her side of the glass. There is a slot in the window partition, about 20 centimeters wide and 8 centimeters tall, for passing documents. The cup fits through it if you angle it slightly. I have been doing this for 6 years, leaving a cup of whatever I'm drinking at the corner of the sill for whoever looks like they need it, and the range of reactions I've received is wide enough to be its own study in human nature. Most people are mildly confused and take it anyway. Some people decline politely, which is fine. Some people look at me like I've offered them a live animal, which I understand. One person, several years ago, asked me if I was required to do this by station policy, and I said no, and they looked at me for a long time, and then took the cup and said, "Thank you," in a voice that made me think it had been a while since anyone had offered them something with no mechanism attached. She looked at the cup. She looked at me. Then she reached through the slot very carefully and took it. She left without saying anything else. I thought about her for approximately 3 minutes, and then I processed the next form in the queue, which was a departure clearance for a pair of Salathi traders who had been on Gara for 6 weeks and had somehow managed to accumulate documentation from 3 different Accord departments that was technically correct but internally contradictory, and that took me the rest of the shift to sort out. She came back 14 days later, Tuesday again, almost to the hour. I had her renewal ready before she reached the sill. I had flagged her record because of the complicated homeworld entry, which is standard practice for me with anything I think might need follow-up, and I had already pulled the renewal form and pre-filled the sections I could from her previous application. She set her documents down. I slid the renewal across. She signed it with the same careful handwriting, returned it. "The tea," she said. "Yesterday's was better. Yesterday's was a Karef blend from the Third Ring Commissary. Today's is Accord issue standard. There's a supply chain disruption with the Karev. The transit shuttle from the Outer Ring has been running reduced loads for the past week due to a cargo dispute between the Commissary and the Outer Ring Freight Authority." She blinked once. "You track the tea supply chain." "I track everything in my corridor," I said. "It's a habit. I find it useful to know when things are likely to change and what the proximate cause is. The cargo dispute should resolve within a week. There's a mediation scheduled. The Karev blend will be back. She looked at me for a moment, those amber eyes with that quality of attention. That is, she said, a very thorough answer. You asked a thorough question, I said. Most people would have just noted that the tea was different and moved on. You mentioned it specifically. That suggested you wanted to understand why. She looked at me for another moment. Then she took the cup. This went on for 11 weeks. I learned things about her in increments, the way you learn anything worth knowing. Not all at once, not from any single grand disclosure, but in small pieces that accumulate until one day you look at what you have and realize it is already a picture. 19 years of this kind of work has taught me that people tell you what they are, whether they mean to or not. You just have to be paying attention. She always came on Tuesdays, within a 30-minute window of the same time, close enough to regular that it was a pattern, but varied enough that it was deliberate variation. She was not arriving at a fixed time. She was arriving within a range, which is the habit of someone who has learned not to be entirely predictable, even in routine things. She always had her documents ready before she reached the sill, in order in the correct sequence for the renewal form. The renewal form for unaffiliated transit residents has 7 sections, and most people hand me the sections in whatever order they grab them from, their bag or their pocket or the worn envelope most of the long-term renewals carry their documents in. She always handed them to me in order. I noticed this on week 3 and started paying closer attention to everything else. On week 4, she made a small error on the Homeworld section. Wrote a date in a format that isn't used in any current Accord registry system. It was an old format, very old. Verith Imperial format specifically, which predates the current Accord calendar by approximately 200 years, and was the official dating system of the Verith court until the succession collapse. It is not something that anyone living uses unless they were raised in a household that still kept old court records or correspondence, or were educated in a context where the old conventions were treated as living, rather than historical. I noted this without saying anything about it and corrected it in the system entry, because it wasn't my business to say anything, and correcting it aloud would have required me to announce, in a processing corridor, that I recognized a 2-century-old dating format from a collapsed empire's court records, which would have raised questions I wasn't prepared to answer and questions she wasn't prepared to be asked. I filed it instead. That's what I do with things I can't use immediately. I put them somewhere careful and I leave them there. On week 5, I noticed she looked at the forms before she signed them. Not in the way most people glance at what they're signing, the cursory scan that confirms. It's more or less what they expected. She read them, fully, carefully, in the same way I read them, the way someone reads something whose specific language they understand matters. Most people who come to my window have no idea what the forms actually say. They've learned to go to the field with the line and sign it. She read every word, and the way her eyes moved told me she was comparing what was there against what she expected. Cross-checking, which is the reading pattern of someone who knows the underlying regulation well enough to evaluate whether the form reflects it accurately. On week 6, she thanked me for the tea. Not in standard, not in any of the 3 or 4 languages that get used commonly on Garev's transit level. In Verith Court Formal, which is a language I happen to know. Not fluently, but well enough, because I read Accord procedural law for recreation, and the pre-Accord Verath compact documents are some of the most precisely drafted legal instruments in the database. The specific phrase she used was Ver Sol Keth, which translates approximately as the kindness is received and held. It's a formal acknowledgement, the kind of thing you'd say in a court context when someone has done something that carries weight. Not a casual thank you, but something with more structure to it, something that implies the gesture has been registered and given its proper significance. She said it quietly, without looking up from her documents. I don't think she knew she'd said it in that language. It came out the way words do when they're so thoroughly habitual that they bypass the filter that translates them first. I said, You're welcome. In standard. Filed it. On week 7, she asked briefly about the cargo dispute resolution. Had the Karev blend returned as I'd predicted? I confirmed it had, and gave her the background on the mediation outcome. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, and then she said, "You were right about a week," as if filing that piece of data about me. I understood then that she was doing the same thing I was doing. We were both paying attention. We were both keeping notes, in our respective ways, about what the other one was. On week 8, I noticed she had a small scar along the outside of her left hand, very fine. The kind of scar that comes from something sharp and very precise, rather than from an accident. It ran from the base of the little finger to the wrist. In most people, a scar in that location would mean nothing particular. In someone with her background, which I was forming more confident hypotheses about every week, that location is where a Vareth succession mark would be inscribed if someone had had one removed. I know this because I had read it in the compact texts while trying to understand a procedural dispute about succession identity confirmation from the archive records, where the removal of a succession mark as a method of concealment for heirs traveling in disputed territory is documented in some detail. I filed that too. I was beginning to have a picture. On week 9, she arrived looking tired in a way she hadn't before, not physically tired. Not the ordinary depletion of poor sleep or a long shift, but the particular exhaustion of someone running a calculation that doesn't have a good answer no matter how many times they run it. The arithmetic of a situation closing in. She took the tea before I'd even pushed it to her side, which was the first time she'd reached for it rather than waiting. 6 more weeks, she said. Not to me, exactly. More like someone checking a number aloud to make it feel real. Before what? I asked. She looked at me. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "Before a deadline I can't talk about." I nodded and stamped her renewal. She left. I spent the rest of my shift thinking about it, which is to say I spent the rest of my shift thinking about the Vareth Compact, specifically the succession clauses, specifically the provision that had been in the Accord News summaries about 3 months prior, when House Drivak filed a forfeiture claim against an unnamed Vareth heir, who had been absent from the throne seat for more than one full Accord cycle. The provision, as I recalled it, and I recalled it quite precisely, because I had read it several times the evening after I saw the news summary, required the absent heir to present herself before an Accord quorum with a sworn civilian witness who could confirm her identity under the witness clause. The witness had to be non-military, non-Varath, non-politically affiliated. The witness had to have known the claimant for at least 60 days. The witness had to be able to identify the claimant by name and face, without assistance, without documentation, from independent recollection alone. And the witness had to make the confirmation verbally, in person, before the quorum, within the remaining time window of the cycle, which, based on the filing date of House Drevak's claim, would close in approximately 7 weeks from when I'd read the news summary. That had been a month ago. 6 weeks, she'd said. I sat with that arithmetic for a long time. On week 10, I began paying a different kind of attention. Not cataloging, not filing, preparing. I went back through everything I had filed over the previous 9 weeks, and I assembled it deliberately. The Vareth imperial dating format, the court formal thank you, the succession to mark scar. The way she've read forms the way someone reads them who knows what the underlying regulation says. The fact that she had, on week 7, referenced a specific provision of the transit code in a question she asked me that suggested familiarity with the legal structure of residency law in general, not just the immediate form. People who know residency law that well are either legal professionals, career administrators, or people who have spent a great deal of time navigating complex jurisdictions from the inside. I also went back and read Section 14 of the Vareth Compact 3 times in a row. The way you read something when you're checking that you've understood it correctly, and not just read what you expected. Section 14 was very clear. Non-military, non-Verath, no political affiliation, known to the claimant for 60 days or more, able to confirm name and face by independent recollection alone. Confirmation made verbally before the quorum, with the civilian witness speaking the claimant's full name. I had known her for 98 days. I knew her face. I knew her name, some of it from the form, and the rest of it from the compact's own documentation of the Vora succession line's throne name. Conventions, which was in Section 32, and which I had read the same evening I reread Section 14, following the thread wherever it went because that is how I read things. I was qualified, every requirement met. I had not manufactured this. I had simply been paying attention for 11 weeks and reading legal documents in the evenings, and the two things had arrived at the same place. I am 41 years old, and I have spent 19 years processing transit forms in a corridor above the Verath border, and I think it is possible that I am the most specifically, improbably, precisely qualified person in the whole of the Accord's jurisdiction to be a civilian witness for a Verath crown heir in hiding at this particular moment in the succession cycle. I thought about this for several days. Then I decided what to do with it. On week 11, Tuesday, the 44th day of cycle 10, the morning her renewal was next due, I arrived at my shift to find two Accord officials in the corridor outside the processing center. They were not subtle. Accord officials almost never are. They have a particular way of standing in civilian spaces that announces, without any words at all, that they believe they are the most important presence in the room and that everyone else is an element of scenery until proven otherwise. These two were in the formal gray of the Tribunal Compliance Division, which is not an arm of the Accord that shows up on transit stations for small administrative matters. I watched them through the corridor window while I set up my station and ran my morning queue check. They were speaking with the station administrator, and the administrator was doing the particular thing station administrators do when they're being helpful to people they're slightly afraid of. Answering every question in complete sentences, volunteering information not asked for, and nodding more than the situation required. The compliance officers had data tablets with them. They were cross-referencing something on the tablets with what the administrator was telling them. I knew what they were looking for. I could not hear what was said, and I didn't need to. My queue had 11 applications for the morning. Her renewal was not in the queue. She walked in. She didn't pre-register, but she was due today. Within the same 30-minute window she always observed. I checked the time. She would arrive in approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes, give or take. I thought about Section 14. I thought about what happened to a claimant who was found by the compliance officers before presenting herself with a witness. The forfeiture filing would proceed, the quorum would convene on House Drevak's terms, and the witness clause would lapse with the cycle. I thought about something else, which was harder to put into procedural language, but was real nonetheless. The thing she'd said on week 10, not to me but through me, into the air of my corridor. 6 more weeks. The weight of a person running a calculation with no good answer. And the thing I had understood slowly, over the preceding weeks. Not from the documents, but from the particular way she said Ver Sol Keth, and didn't know she'd said it. From the specific care with which she handed me her documents in the right order. From the fact that she always confirmed, at the end of each transaction, the date she needed to return. The care of a person maintaining the last small structures of a life that has been stripped of almost everything else. She had not told me. She could not. She was doing the thing people in her situation do, holding the runway as long as possible and hoping something would change. I was in a position to be something that changed. I had been in that position for weeks, and the only reason I had waited was that I wanted to understand the full picture before I moved in it. I understood the full picture now. I processed my queue through the morning. The compliance officers spent about 40 minutes with the station administrator and then moved into the corridor itself, speaking with various station employees and checking faces against whatever was on their tablets. I watched them work. They were being methodical, which was the right approach, and if they stayed methodical, they would find her eventually. Today, probably, within her arrival window. Garev is not a large station. She arrived at my window at the 217th minute of my shift. I know the minute precisely because I had been tracking it. She set her documents on the sill. She looked at me. Then her attention moved, briefly, to the two compliance officers visible through the partition glass at the far end of the corridor. They had their backs to us, speaking with the corridor supervisor, but they were close enough that she could identify what they were. She looked back at me. I put the tea on the sill. "I think," I said very quietly, "that they are looking for you." She did not move. She did not speak. Something happened in her eyes that I did not have a clean word for. Not fear, not panic. The particular quality of stillness that comes at the end of a long calculation when the final term resolves and you understand what it means. "And I think," I said, at the same volume, "that I am the person you need." The silence that followed was long enough that I had time to wonder, with some genuine anxiety that I did not let show on my face, whether I had misjudged the situation badly enough to have caused real harm. Then she said, "Not quite a question, an inventory request. I know that you have been filing renewal forms at my window for 11 weeks. I know that you write dates in Verith Imperial format when you are not concentrating on the translation. You've done it 4 times. I know that you speak court formal when you are not concentrating either. You've done that once, significantly. I know what a succession mark removal scar looks like and exactly where on the hand it appears, because it's in the archive records, and I know that the scar on your left hand matches the location precisely. I know that you read forms the way someone reads them who understands the underlying regulation, not just the surface instruction. I know that you've been counting down to a deadline and that as of last week you had 6 weeks left, which by my count puts you approximately in the range of the Verith Compact's witness clause closure. I paused. "And I know your name." She looked at me steadily. "You know the name on the form," she said. "I know more than that," I said, "but we would need somewhere private before I say it." Quiet. 4 seconds, 5. "How long," she said, "have you known?" "I have been accumulating evidence since week 4. I was reasonably confident by week 8. I have been thinking about the compact's requirements since week 10, specifically whether I met them." I slid her renewal form across the sill, stamped. "Your extension is valid for 14 days, but I don't think you have 14 days. The compliance officers have been working this corridor for approximately 3 hours. They are methodical. If they don't find you this shift, they'll find you by tomorrow, and when they find you without a witness, the forfeiture filing proceeds." She looked at the stamped renewal. She looked at the compliance officers, still with their backs to us, moving now toward the far window stations. She looked at me. "Why," she said quietly, "would you do this?" I considered that question seriously the way it deserved. "Because you come to my window every Tuesday and you're the only person who tells me when the tea is worse than it should be," I said. "And because I have read the compact, and the witness clause is very precisely structured, and I happen to meet every stated requirement, and it would seem wasteful not to use something I qualify for. And because I know what a person looks like when they are running out of runway, and it seems like the right thing to do about it when you can." I paused. "And because you always hand me the documents in the right order, and in 19 years of this work, very few people have done that, and I have found that I notice it." She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. I am not easily made uncomfortable by silence. "My full name," she said carefully, "is not on the form. I know. If you're going to stand before the quorum as my witness, you need to know my full name." "I have a hypothesis," I said. "If you would like to hear it." She waited. "In Verith succession tradition," I said, "the crown heir carries a throne name in 7 parts. The first 2 parts are the personal name and the primary house designation, Thesara Vael. I have those from your registration. The third part is the lineage marker. For the Vora succession line, per the compact documents in Section 32, It is the phrase Keth Sorath, which designates the unbroken continuity of the Vora primary line. The fourth part is the seat title, Andam, which appears throughout the compact texts as the designation for the Vora throne seat specifically. The fifth and sixth parts are variable by individual, the succession index and the cycle of ascension, and I do not have those. The seventh part, per section 14 subsection 3, is spoken by the civilian witness in the quorum chamber at the moment of confirmation, not by the claimant. So you need only give me parts 5 and 6. I can produce the rest. The silence this time was different, not the stillness of calculation, something else. How, she said, not loudly. The word landed quietly and precisely. How do you know all of that? Section 32 of the original compact archive. It covers the throne name construction conventions for each of the 6 recognized succession houses in detail. Vora is among the most thoroughly documented, because the Vora line had the longest unbroken succession record before the collapse, and the scribes who maintained it were apparently very thorough. I paused. I read it that same evening I reread section 14. I tend to follow threads. She pressed her lips together very briefly, something that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. Part 5, she said quietly, is Verithsal. Part 6 is Andrath Kale. I filed both immediately, the way I file everything, precisely and completely, in the right order. Thesara Vale Keth Sorath Ondam Verithsal Andrath Kale, I said. And the 7th part, per section 14 subsection 3, is spoken in the quorum chamber by the witness at the moment of confirmation. That would be me. She looked at me. I looked at her. The compliance officers had turned around and were now moving toward our end of the corridor. We have perhaps 3 minutes, I said. Do you want to contact the quorum registrar, or should I? I contact registrars constantly, I said. It's part of the job. I'll send the message now. We need a room, somewhere the officers won't immediately look. The third ring commissary has a private section, she said. Workers' entrance on the left side. I know where it is, I said, because I do know where everything on this station is, after 19 years. I picked up my communication device and sent a formal request to the quorum registry for an emergency hearing slot under section 14 of the Verith Succession Compact. As I sent it, I locked my window station and put up the processing, "Please return." In 10 minutes placard, which is the only official tool I have for disappearing from my post temporarily. Window 3, she said, reading my nameplate the way she'd read it on week 1, and then again on week 6, and each time after that, checking, confirming. She said my name the way she'd said Ver Sol Keth, precisely, like she was placing it somewhere she intended it to stay. That's right, I said. Aldric Sonn, the commissary. Now, we left through the side corridor. The compliance officers reached my window approximately 40 seconds after we were gone, based on what the corridor camera logs showed later. The Accord hearing chamber on Garev's upper ring was built for more important occasions than this transit station typically hosts, and the gap between what it was built for and what it usually gets used for is visible in everything. The high vaulted ceiling that gives every word a half second of echo. The curved quorum bench that seats 20 in a room where today we had 9. The acoustic paneling that was installed with genuine care for resonance, and that now mostly amplifies the sound of the ventilation system, and the distant logistics of the transit ring below. The chamber smells of cleaning compound, and underneath it, something older and heavier, the particular smell of institutional authority accumulated over decades. I had been in this chamber twice before, once for a residency appeal where I was the filing clerk on record, once for a jurisdictional dispute between 2 Accord departments that I had been asked to testify about on procedural grounds. I knew where the witness podium was. I knew the protocol. I had reviewed section 14 again on my communication device while we waited in the commissary for the quorum slot to be confirmed, not because I had forgotten it, but because I wanted the specific language fresh. There were 9 quorum delegates when we arrived, 5 standard Accord representatives, 3 human, 1 Keth adjacent, 1 Salathi affiliate, and 4 specific to the Vareth matter. The 2 compliance officers I recognized from the corridor, a delegate from the Accord's succession oversight body, who had the deliberate stillness of someone who has presided over a great many consequential moments, and a representative of House Dravak who I recognized from a recent Accord news filing as Dravak's appointed counsel for the succession claim. The Dravak counsel was younger than me, younger than her, with very good posture and a pale blue-gray formal jacket that was slightly too considered for this room and this occasion, which told me something about his assessment of what today was going to be. He had come to witness a formality complete itself in his house's favor. He looked at her when she came in, at her plain clothes, her pulled-back hair, nothing marking her as anything other than the unaffiliated transit resident she had been registered as for 11 weeks. And I saw him register the absence of ceremony with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was its close neighbor. He looked at me, a transit clerk in a gray jacket, standard issue, the kind of jacket that announces nothing. He looked at me the way people look at furniture, confirming it exists, confirming it is not in the way, moving on. He filed me as unremarkable and returned his attention to his documents. I have been filed as unremarkable before. It does not bother me. The value of being unremarkable is that no one prepares for you. He had prepared for a lot of things today. He had not prepared for me. She sat at the claimant's table. I sat at the witness table. The quorum chair, Delegate Savar, a human Accord representative whom I knew by name and by reputation as someone who ran proceedings with precision and no particular patience for unnecessary theater, called the session to order and confirmed the particulars. The Vareth Compact, Section 14, the witness clause, the claimant's voluntary appearance, the witness's registration as Aldric Sonn, transit form clerk, Class 4 civilian, non-military, non-Vareth, no political affiliation on record. The witness attests to having known the claimant for a period exceeding 60 days. Delegate Savar said, and to being able to confirm the claimant's identity by independent recollection alone. Yes, I said. The Dravak counsel leaned forward. Delegate Savar, for the record, the proposed witness is employed at this station, and therefore, Section 14 does not exclude station employees, I said. The exclusion list covers military personnel, Vareth nationals, and individuals with documented political affiliation to any party with a material interest in the succession outcome. Transit form clerks appear nowhere in the exclusion list. Delegate Savar looked at me with an expression I recognized from experienced administrators when someone does their job correctly without being asked to explain it. The witness is correct. Section 14's exclusion list is enumerated and exhaustive. The objection is not sustained. She turned back to me. The quorum calls the witness to the podium. I stood up. I walked to the podium. It was slightly too tall, built for Vareth height, I thought, given the chamber's original purpose. So I adjusted my stance accordingly and put my hands on the sides of it and looked at the quorum delegates in the order they were seated. You have attested, Delegate Savar said, to knowing the individual seated at the claimant's table by independent recollection for a period exceeding 60 days. Yes, describe the basis of that knowledge. She is presented at my processing window, window 3, Garev Transit Processing Corridor, on 11 consecutive renewal cycles, each 14 days apart. I have processed her renewal documentation on each occasion. I have spoken with her at most of those visits on matters related to station operations and in general conversation. I have observed her consistently over that period, and I know her face. And her name, yes, please state it. I looked at the quorum bench. I looked at the Dravak counsel, who was watching me with the relaxed attention of someone waiting for an amateur to misstep. Then I looked at her. She was sitting very still at the claimant's table, her hands flat on the surface, her amber eyes steady and absolutely calm in the way things are calm when they have moved past fear into something more resolved. I said her name. Thesara Vale Keth Sorath Andam Vareth Sol Andrith Kale. I said it the way I file things, carefully, in order, unhurried, with the particular confidence of someone who has verified each element and knows exactly where it belongs. The chamber went quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next procedural step. The quiet of a room that has been surprised by something that wasn't expected to happen. The kind of quiet that falls when a thing that was supposed to be a formality turns out to be real. I watched it move across the delegates' faces in sequence. The 3 human accord representatives with their careful neutrality going slightly less neutral. The secession oversight delegate leaning forward by perhaps a centimeter. The compliance officers exchanging a look that was fast and controlled, but not fast enough to be invisible. The Keth-adjacent delegate's second set of eyelids closing briefly, which in Keth-adjacent physiology is the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. The Dryvac Council had gone completely still. I said, the 7th part of the throne name, per section 14, subsection 3, is spoken by the civilian witness in the presence of the quorum at the moment of confirmation. The acknowledgement, as specified in the original compact text, section 14, subsection 3, paragraph 2, is as follows. I had memorized the old Verith Court formal phrasing the previous evening, once I was certain the hearing was confirmed. She is known to me, and I to her, and this I speak before any authority that holds the compact binding. The room stayed quiet. Delegate Savar said, after a moment that felt longer than it was, the witness has stated the throne name in full and has spoken the witness acknowledgement per the compact's specified form. For the record, does any member of this quorum dispute the procedure? Silence. Does House Dryvac challenge the witness's knowledge of the claimant's name? The Dryvac Council opened his mouth. I watched him close it. He looked at the woman at the claimant's table. Really looked at her. The way you look at something when the frame around it has just changed. Completely. And then he looked at me. And then he looked at his documents. And I could see him running the arithmetic. The name in 7 parts. The procedural accuracy. The documented requirements met. House Dryvac, he said, with the careful precision of a man recalibrating, does not challenge the witness's knowledge. Delegate Savar nodded once. The quorum will deliberate. They deliberated for 11 minutes. We waited in the outer corridor. She stood near the wall. I stood near the window. From the window you could see the lower transit ring, the departure queue backed up in the afternoon. The ordinary business of the station, continuing on its schedule, regardless of what was happening. Level up. I thought about my queue at window 3 and whether Parath, the evening clerk, had arrived on time for once. Parath is chronically 8 to 12 minutes late, a habit so consistent it has become a kind of station institution. She is, in every other respect, an excellent clerk. I have made my peace with the 8 to 12 minutes. I also thought about what I had said at the podium, not second-guessing it. I had said it correctly. I was confident of that. But considering it, the way you consider the weight of a thing after you've put it down. 7 parts of a name in a chamber with 9 delegates and an acoustic system that had made each syllable land with more weight than an ordinary room would have given it. The way the room had gone quiet, not the Dryvac Council's silence, which was strategic and would not last the other silence. The delegates who had arrived expecting a procedural failure and found instead someone who had read Section 32's appendix and practiced the stress pattern on Andrath Kale that morning in his apartment above the transit ring. I had been a clerk for 19 years. I had sat at window 3 and processed faces and forms, and I had read the compact because it was interesting, and I had filed things I could not use. Yet and I had left a cup of tea at the corner of the sill because it seemed like the right thing. None of that had been preparation, and all of it had been. You said the acknowledgement in the original form, she said. Not a question. I looked it up last night. The current Accord Registry version of Section 14 abbreviates the subsection 3 language. I thought the original form was more accurate to the intent. It is. She was quiet for a moment. The original form is in the archive texts. Very few people access those. I mentioned that I read the compact for recreation. You mentioned it, she said. I don't think I fully understood what that meant until this afternoon. I didn't say anything. After a moment, she said, You practiced it. The name. I said it aloud several times this morning, yes. I wanted to be certain of the stress pattern on Andrath Kale. The second syllable of Kale carries the emphasis, per the phonological notes in Section 32's appendix. She was quiet again. When she spoke, it was with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing words that can carry what they mean. No one, she said, has said my full name in 10 months. I looked at her. I removed it from the station registry when I arrived. I knew a searchable entry was a risk I couldn't manage. I registered as Thessera Vale, and I left the rest of it somewhere I couldn't access easily. Because you cannot carry something that size openly when you're hiding, and you cannot keep saying it in the dark, because at a certain point, a name in the dark starts to feel like a weight, and then it starts to feel like a possibility, and you cannot afford either. She looked out the corridor window. After a while, you wonder if it still belongs to you. I thought about that. I thought about 11 Tuesdays and the care with which she handed me documents in the right order. The care that was one of the last small structures of a life that had been stripped of most of its others. It belongs to you, I said. She looked at me. Something in her expression that I hadn't seen before and didn't have a word for yet. Not the watchful calculation that lived there most of the time, not the practiced stillness. Something less defended. Something that had decided, or was deciding, that the situation warranted it. Yes, she said. Apparently it does. The door opened and Delegate Savar's clerk called us back in. The quorum chair read the finding in full, which took just over 4 minutes. The substance of it, the witness clause had been satisfied. The identification confirmed, the forfeiture claim of House Dravac denied as procedurally moot, and the Vora succession standing recognized as valid and active for the current accord cycle, and the transition proceedings to follow. The Dravac Council left quickly, without speaking, with the efficiency of someone who has an urgent need to be somewhere other than where they are. The compliance officers came and spoke with her at the front of the chamber. Logistics, I understood, about the formal succession steps, the return to Verath, the transition period documentation that would need to be processed over the following weeks. She spoke to them in the careful, even way she spoke to everything, and I stayed near the wall and listened to the ventilation hum and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which is a thing I am good at when the moment calls for it. The compliance officers left. The quorum delegates filed out in the practiced, efficient way of people returning to other work. The succession oversight delegate paused near the door and looked at me with an expression that was almost but not quite readable, and then she left. The chamber clerk packed the recording equipment with neat, practiced movements and let herself out, closing the door behind her, with the understanding of someone who recognized that the room still contained something that hadn't finished yet. She came to where I was standing by the wall. We were alone. The chamber was very quiet. Outside, the distant sounds of the transit ring, the ordinary work of the station. She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back at her. I should tell you something about Verath succession custom, she said. All right. When the civilian witness speaks the throne name in full and speaks the acknowledgement, per the old compact, the original text, there is a reciprocal clause. She paused. The current Accord database uses the abridged version of Section 14. The original archive text continues past what the current version includes. The additional passage specifies that the claimant, if the succession is confirmed, speaks the throne name in full to the witness privately, not before the quorum, afterward. As an act that is not procedural, she stopped. As an act that is personal, I process this. I have not read the full original archive text, I said. Only the sections in the current database and the documents referenced in the footnotes. I know. I could tell from the questions you asked, and the ones you didn't ask, that you hadn't read the full archive. What does the reciprocal clause specify in terms of its meaning? She was quiet for a moment. It means the name is given, not to satisfy a requirement. To the person. The chamber was very still. Thesara Vale Keth Sorath Ondum Vereth Sol Andrath Kale, she said. She said it the way I had said it at the podium, carefully, in order, without hurrying, but not with the same quality, not procedural, something that the word procedural doesn't reach. She said it the way she'd said Veir Sol Keth on week 6, when she wasn't concentrating on the translation, a thing so habitual and so specific that it came from somewhere underneath the surface layer that controls what you say and how you say it. She said it the way you say something you have been carrying alone for a long time and are finally setting down in a place that has been made worthy of it. I stood still and listened to every part of it, and when she was done, I said, "I will remember that." "I know you will," she said. "You file things." Yes, she looked at me. There was something in her expression that was close to a smile, in the way that the memory of something is close to the thing itself. Not present, not absent. "The succession process will require approximately 3 months, she said. "The transition period documentation is substantial. Section 22 of the Compact covers the witness requirements for the transition period. I'm not familiar with Section 22. The requirements are similar to Section 14. Non-military, non-verith, no political affiliation. Known to the claimant for a period of," she paused, "considerably longer than 60 days at this point." I looked at her. "I would need to review Section 22 before I could say whether I qualified." "Of course. And my shift schedule would need to be arranged. Garev's transit authority doesn't have a formal protocol for seconding clerks to accord witness proceedings. I'd need to negotiate the terms. Naturally, it would take 2 or 3 days. The transit authority is thorough but not fast. I have some experience," she said, "with waiting." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Aldric Sonn, that's who I am. Window 3, Garev Transit Corridor. I process forms and track supply chains and read procedural law in the evenings." "Yes," she said, "I know. I want to be clear about that. Before anything else, that's who I am." She looked at me with those amber eyes, steady and warm. "Aldric Sonn," she said. The way she said it was the same way she had said it on week 1, week 6, and the moment before we left the corridor, precisely, deliberately, placed somewhere she intended it to stay. "I know exactly who you are." She paused. "In Verith reckoning, the 5th part of a person's name is not given at birth. It is earned." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "Contact the registry for Section 22, she said. "When you have reviewed it." I did. That evening, in my apartment, with the coffee press running slow and the database open on the table. Section 22 was, if anything, more carefully drafted than Section 14. Whoever had written the original compact had understood something that good law always understands, that the law is only as reliable as the people it asks to act, and that when you ask someone to stand in front of a room full of people who would prefer a different truth and say a true thing clearly, you should do them the courtesy of writing the requirement with precision and treating their word as real. I read Section 22 twice. Then I found the full original archive text and read the reciprocal clause completely. All 4 paragraphs. The last sentence was in the old Verath court formal, and I had to work through it slowly with the phonological notes open in a second. "Window," it said, as far as I could parse it. "The name given in the private hour is not a transaction but a covenant, and it is kept as long as the one who holds it chooses to hold it." I sat with that for a while. Then I closed the database, looked at my coffee, and thought about 11 Tuesdays, about the cup going through the slot in the window and the careful reach to take it, about Veir Sol Keth, said in the old court formal to someone who had been speaking standard all morning, about documents handed in order, in a corridor where no one else handed them that way, about a name said in a chamber with a slightly too tall podium and 9 delegates, and the particular quiet that falls when something real happens in a room that was prepared for something formal, about a name said in a corridor after, differently. I went to my desk and wrote the application for temporary secondment to accord civilian witness services under the Verath succession. Compact, Section 22. The first such application in Garev's transit authority history, as far as I could determine, and I submitted it before I went to sleep. In the morning, I sent her a message through the Accord's witness registry. I have read Section 22. My application is filed. The transit authority will require 2 to 3 days to process it as there is no existing protocol. I will be at window 3 in the meantime. The tea will be Karev blend. Her response came in 11 minutes. It said, Karev blend is acceptable. The fifth part of a name is determined in Verath. There is a ceremony. It takes approximately 40 minutes and involves a considerable volume of very old documentation. I read that 3 times. Then I replied, I look forward to reviewing the documentation. Her response took almost 20 minutes, which I chose to interpret as evidence of careful composition rather than hesitation. It said, Aldric Sonn, you are a very strange man, I replied. I have been told this, she said. I find I don't mind it. I put down the communication device and looked out the window of my apartment at the transit. Ring below, at the departure queue beginning to form in the early morning light, at the long corridor of window 3, where I had spent 19 years watching faces and filing things and paying the kind of attention that other people sometimes mistake for smallness, and that I have always understood to be the opposite. The difference between smallness and attention is this. Smallness is a limit, attention is a practice. You choose it every day at the same window, in the same gray jacket, for the same people who hand you their documents in whatever order they grabbed them, and occasionally for the one who hands them to you in the right order and says thank you in a language she doesn't realize she's using. I picked up the coffee press, still too slow. I have been a transit form clerk for 19 years, and I want to be clear, again, that I say this not as an apology for my life, but as a plain description of the kind of man I am. The kind of man who reads procedural law in the evenings because it is interesting, and because you never know when it will be useful. The kind of man who tracks the tea supply chain and files things he can't use yet and pays attention to the order in which people hand him their documents. The kind of man who stands at a podium in a room full of Accord delegates and speaks a name in 7 parts with the calm of someone who prepared it carefully and knows where every piece belongs. The kind of man who says, I know her, and means it, and can prove it. The morning was quiet and the transit ring was beginning to move, and the coffee press was taking exactly as long as it always takes. And I thought about a name in a corridor after a hearing, said not for procedure, said for the person, and I thought about the specific weight of Ver Sol Keth, spoken by someone who did not know they were speaking it. And I thought about the 5th part of a name that is not given at birth but earned, and what that might come to mean in the months ahead with their considerable volume of very old documentation. The kindness is received and held. I filed that thought in the place I keep things I intend to carry for a long time. Then I finished my coffee and went to work.